All right, so thanks for coming. I appreciate it, and I figure I'll just jump right into some of the questions I had for you. Um, Recently, Ted Kaczynski.
You're recording now, sorry.
Yeah, I'm recording.
Yeah, okay.
So Ted Kaczynski passed away. I mean, fairly recently, and I was wondering, how do you think history will view him, given his works and given his actions? How do you think history is going to look back on him?
Well, yeah, I think pretty kindly. He's been vilified, obviously, since he committed his crimes back in the early '90s, or even the '80s, late '80s. So yeah, that's really all they've been talking about is sort of the crimes and the people who got killed and harmed by the bombs. Um, but almost no one wanted to talk about the issues, which was the problem with technology, what we're going to do about it, and so forth. And that, of course, was the whole point. The point was not to harm people. The point was to get a message out that was an important message that had to be read by a lot of people in order to have a chance to make an effect. And so that succeeded. He got a lot of readers when he released his manifesto in 1996 or 95, sorry. And so, yeah, I mean, it got tremendous readership. People in authority, of course, did not like it because it threatens their system, it threatens their power base, it threatens their infrastructure. So we've got nothing but slanderous treatment of Ted personally, and we've got zero discussion of the ideas in the manifesto. That's basically where we stand even today. As long as he was alive, we had the excuse that, well, he committed these crimes and he's in prison, but he still knows what's going on, and we don't want to give him any satisfaction to talk about his ideas in a serious way. And that was the excuse we heard for years. To me, that made no sense. And obviously, I talked about it seriously. A few other people did, but not very many. But now that he's died, so yeah, what was it, a year ago or a little over a year ago? I lost track. But so the presumption was that now that he's gone, we can talk about it because he can't get any satisfaction. He's dead and gone. But no, they still don't want to talk about it. As far as I know, there's no one that's taking these ideas seriously. No one's talking about technology as a problem in a serious way. No one's talking about the manifesto yet. I mean, there's again scattered people who are interested, like you, in doing this podcast. I've talked to a few people like this. I'm actually going to Europe next week, and I'm giving an invited talk on Kaczynski and his manifesto. So I mean, there's some sort of scattered interest around the U.S. and Europe in these ideas, as there should be, because they're vitally important ideas. And I think, I guess, to answer your question, right, in the long run, I think he will be vindicated, because basically his argument is correct. Everything that he said was a valid analysis. Most of his analysis was not original to him, which a lot of people do not know. A lot of those ideas came from earlier thinkers, in particular Jacques Ellul. And anybody who's read the manifesto, I recommend they read Ellul's book, The Technological Society, which is really sort of the foundational work where a lot of these ideas came from. It's harder to read in Ellul's version. It's more academic. I mean, it's well written. It's great. It's a great book, classic book, especially the first couple of chapters. But it's not accessible like Kaczynski's work is. And Ellul wrote his in French in 1954, so he was dealing with technology issues of the 50s, which are obviously much different than they were in the 90s when Kaczynski was writing, and much different again today in the mid 2020s. So the situation keeps changing. It keeps getting worse, but in general, it validates what both Kaczynski and Ellul wrote. So I think, yeah, in the long run, he'll be proven correct. Maybe a kind of a visionary, and I even put in writing that he may be kind of a savior if we take these ideas seriously and we actually do something about it. we'll have to thank him for bringing these issues forcefully into the public eye. But, that's down the road, and it remains to be seen if that will happen.
Yeah, I mean, Jacques Ellul is another one of my favorite reads. He talks about how, the education system has sort of been turned into a producer of technicians as opposed to a development of the human being, kind of. Another question I had is that in light of the recent sort of pandemic, one thing I know you've written about and talked about is how we have to start viewing these things as technical failures. That basically these sort of catastrophes are essentially, in part, technical failures, but it doesn't seem like mainstream society is ready to link these types of incidences with any sort of technical failure. Do you think that that link will grow stronger over time, or what type of event will it take to sort of wake people up to the dangers of technology?
Well, right. So that's a good question because obviously to this point, everything that happens in the human sphere in society has human action involved, um, and so when these disasters happen, typically the government and the media will point to the human element and they'll say, well, somebody was a malevolent actor, or somebody screwed up, or somebody made a mistake, right? They'll talk about the human component of it and they completely disregard the technological component, which of course enables all these things to happen. So it's at best, you cannot talk about the one without the other. And arguably, it's primarily the technological component which is causing and allowing these things to happen. So yeah, for the COVID pandemic, we got a couple of different stories because they still don't really tell us the truth. It was either a kind of a natural event that sort of came out of nature and got spread through these markets in China and then spread to people and then around the world, or it was kind of a lab event, which was either being tested on just experimentally, or maybe deliberately created, maybe a bioweapon that was engineered. We don't know. There's a lot of possibilities out there. And then either it escaped from a lab or got released from a lab on purpose as a kind of a ploy attack on China or whoever. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways that could go, but really just the fact that you had a pandemic doesn't happen unless there's a relatively advanced technology, because it takes lots of people in high density living conditions and a rapid transportation system, relatively rapid, to move the virus around. In the old days, in the hunter-gatherer days, when you had small bands of people who were relatively isolated, we can imagine they ran into diseases from time to time, and maybe they caught something that was equivalent to a plague or some kind of very dangerous disease, and if at worst it wiped out the band of 100 or 150 people, and that was it. It never really spread, and that's the way nature sort of intends things to happen, right? Animal species, including us, are dispersed and they're not all interlinked, and therefore something attacks one, it doesn't affect the whole genome, right? The whole species. But now, thanks to technology, we have high-speed transportation, which by jet planes, we're traveling viruses around around the world in a matter of hours. We have very high densities, vastly abnormally high living densities, where people live in dense city, urban configurations that are thousands of times more dense than they used to be in hunter-gatherer times. And all these things, sort of really, really propagate this disease very rapidly. And then all the solutions, the fixes are technological solutions, right? So we got a high-tech vaccine using mRNA, some experimental kind of thing, and everybody's got to get vaccinated, and we got to roll this out by the billions, and it's a high-tech process to produce it, manufacture, and distribute it. The whole thing from start to finish of COVID was a technological story of disaster or attack, and then solution was a technological solution. I mean, so A to Z, front to back, it was a technological event. Yes, and sure, obviously there was a human component involved, but the technology made the conditions possible and the event possible, and maybe even made the virus possible if it was engineered. That's a very high-tech kind of thing to go around engineering viruses. So yeah, I mean, it was really a thoroughly technological disaster. it disrupted a lot of lives, but it did not kill a lot of people, right? I guess I don't know the final stats. I don't know, 5 million or something globally.
Something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, okay, so that sounds bad, 5 million people, but out of 8 billion, that's like nothing. That's not even a blip. You recover that much in a couple of days, basically, of births. So yeah, compared to like the Black Plague in the Black Death, the plague in Europe in the 1300s would have killed a third of the population or something. So that was significant. But yeah, COVID not even close. Now, yeah. So there's a fair chance that the next go round, whether it's a next natural event or next engineered event or next bioweapon event, could well be much worse, and it could, yeah, conceivably kill millions or billions. I mean, it's not impossible. Um, so yeah, I would like to prepare people to see that as a technological disaster if and when something like that happens, because something will happen. It's virtually inevitable. And I'm trying to get people to realize that technology makes these things possible, in fact, makes them inevitable. And it doesn't do any good just to go around blaming people like, well, somebody was bad and somebody made a mistake and somebody's lab procedure wasn't very good, so this virus got out. And I mean, that's sort of nonsense, right? It's really a technological process that's led to this kind of disaster. And there's lots more like it in the making, which, some of we know about, some I'm sure we don't even know about. So yeah, a lot of potential for big disaster in the coming few years, really.
So another thing I know that you've written about is you argue sort of for a more benign revolutionary theory, I would say. Like you sort of argue that we can, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from my reading of your work, you sort of argue that we can do a gradual retrenchment of technology. Basically, like we slowly roll the clock back until we reach, you can debate at the time period, but the point is we can do a gradual retrenchment of technology, as opposed to Ted Kaczynski, who would argue you have to do sort of, an all-out war, total, destruction, kind of like blitzkrieg, like it's got to be rapid,
Right.
we got to knock this down. Why do you think your theory as to how to do this is more viable than, Ted Kaczynski's? Because, I think he would sort of argue against that kind of idea that actually that would actually be an impossibility, and really the only chance we have is, that one quote he had, it's like, keep fighting, keep struggling, like, underdogs have won in the past. Why is your theory what it is, as opposed to, more aligned with Ted Kaczynski's more, we got to knock it down, potentially even violently?
Yeah, right. So the issue is kind of typically posed as reform versus revolt, right? So most people who, when they begin to understand there's problems with the technological system, they want to reform it, right? So they say, well, we'll pick out the bad components of it. We'll tackle those one at a time. We'll fix those, eliminate those, and then everything will be good, right? And if something new comes up bad, well, we'll tackle that one. We'll fix that one. We'll go to the next thing. So the basic premise that most people have is, technology is basically good and we like it and it's necessary. So all we can do is fix the little problems when they pop up, and then just keep rolling ahead. So the problem is that doesn't really work. That's like superficial fixes, band-aid solutions, which seem to work in some cases, but typically are only partial, are only temporary, and typically have unanticipated side effects, which are as bad or worse than the original problem that you were trying to fix. So there's lots of good arguments. It's kind of really interesting discussion in itself to see why this whole reform process basically will not work. It's again, kind of patch things over, can buy you a little time. That's really about all it can do. So that's why Kaczynski and others, Ellul and Lewis Mumford and myself, basically saying, yeah, reform will not work. So something more radical, more revolutionary is going to be required, which is basically displacing the system, deconstructing it, getting rid of it in one shape or another. So anything like that is considered a revolutionary approach. Jacques Ellul talked about that very briefly in the intro to his book. He wasn't dealing with a social manifesto, but there's a couple interesting comments at the beginning of his book about that. Other people, Ivan Illich, Herbert Marcuse, and Mumford, even before all these guys are before the time of Kaczynski, talked about dismantling or deconstructing this mega machine of modern technology. So it's again, it's an established idea, but no one has really gone into details like what exactly does that mean and how would you go about doing that? Even Kaczynski, right? So he's kind of basically of the view that the system is very kind of rigid and interlocked and interdependent. All the parts are interlocked, and you can't just start messing with little bits and pieces and expect to fix things. It's like a watch, you know. Watch, all the parts are intricately designed to work together. You can't just change one little gear and, you know, make it a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, and expect everything to work. No, it won't work that way. So he's basically, look, you just kind of have to attack the thing at the foundation. The whole system is very, let's say, unstable because of these very strong feedback loops and because of lots of stress on humans and stress on nature. And so it will, there's a fair chance that once it starts to crumble, it may just sort of implode like a building, you know, like you blow up a skyscraper, right? It just comes crashing down. And that's kind of how Kaczynski, I think, talks about it, right? That we need to take some kind of action in a very a nondescript way. He's kind of quite vague. There was a couple of essays outside of the manifesto and a couple of points in the manifesto where he talked about things that we could do, but it's really quite vague. But somehow that's the hope anyway, is that you're going to increase the stress on the system. There's already stress on the system. We're going to increase the stress on the system to cause it collapse. Once it collapses, just stand back and run for the hills, and it's going down in a cloud of dust, you know, like the 9/11 towers. Then you pick up your pieces and you try to survive the best you can after that. Now, so that could happen. It could happen whether we help it or not, whether we like it or not. That could well happen, and I've sort of always been open about that. That's one very possible scenario that we're facing. Just instabilities, intrinsic instabilities, and the system just starts to come unraveled, and then because you need the technology to maintain the technology. So there's lots of feedback loops. Again, if those start to unwind, yeah, the whole thing could unravel like a house of cards. It could just kind of crumbling down, and then it's going to stay down for a long time if that happens. But so I'm trying to offer up another alternative, a different form of revolution, right? That's a little bit more sort of not as catastrophic. I mean, if a sudden collapse happens, then lots of people will die because you can't do that kind of thing. Lots of literally billions of people's lives are dependent on the ongoing structure of the system as it is. And if that system goes away quickly, you know, in whatever, it could be a month, it could be a day, it could be a year. I mean, that's relatively quickly. Then yeah, lots of people will die. Hundreds of millions at least, probably billions would die. And I'm kind of like saying, well, you know, there are other alternatives maybe where you don't have to have millions or billions of people dying. And that's if you sort of deliberately and slowly kind of deconstruct the system. Again, it's like if you have a rotting old, you know, big skyscraper, which is crumbling apart, you can either blow it up or you sort of go at the top and you start disassembling it kind of piece by piece and you work your way down. It takes a little bit longer than blowing it up, but it's a little bit slower, it's safer, it doesn't create a big catastrophe, and you just sort of deconstruct it down as far as you need to go, and then your job is done. So that's kind of what I'm saying for a technological system, that we can do something like a gradual unwinding of the system where we're kind of slowly retracting our most recent and most dangerous technologies and then working our way effectively backward in time. I talked about running the movie in reverse, right? Running the film in reverse to wind it back to where it's safe for people to live, and you can still sustain a high level of culture and society and meet basic human needs. And that's certainly possible. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's not like it's impossible to do. It's actually very possible to do, especially, as I've argued, if you leave yourself enough time. And I've written a couple of pieces, and there's another one coming out in the relatively near future, probably next year, along the same lines, of like taking a long time, 80 years or 100 years. It's a nice target to the end of the century. So yeah, I guess now we're down to about 75 years, right? But something like that time frame, 75 to 100 years, create a plan to unwind yourself from the brink, because basically we're sort of at the brink of a catastrophe here. And if you just work backwards and just start with the latest, most dangerous things, and you could take the technologies that Bill Joy talked about in 2000 in his article on why the future doesn't need us. He talked about the GNR technologies, right? Genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics, GNR. And those seem to be particularly dangerous. I guess now we would add AI in there maybe as another recent component. And you might kind of say, you know, these things should no longer exist because they're just too dangerous for humanity and the planet. So we're just gonna, yeah, I don't know, you have to pull those out of existence, ban them, stop the research, global sanctions, you know, like you would with any like chemical weapons or, you know, nuclear weapons in some cases. You got to, you know, ban them, you know, and you sanction people and you root them out and you pull those things out of existence basically. And we could work our way, start with the most dangerous ones. You work your way backwards, right? So you'd have to go back to, you know, early internet time and pull the plug on the global internet. You know, working back, you'd have to kind of get rid of electronic communications. You'd have to get rid of television and radio. We're just talking going back to where it's safe, right? And it's a long way back. This is a little bit, I don't know, shocking, I guess, but certainly anything within, say, the time of the Industrial Revolution, which was, say, the early 1700s, that led to sort of the current accelerationist phase of modern technology, because we're using fossil fuels and we're producing faster machines, and the machines are creating faster machines, and so forth. That led to electricity, right? Exactly. So you have an exponential upward growth. The system is feeding on itself. So if you want to get to a safe state, you've got to get prior to that state of the Industrial Revolution. So you've got to get prior to, say, the technology of 1700 or so. So back to that point where it was not possible to do that anymore. You've got to stop accessing those fossil fuels and get to pre-industrial levels. So, you know, in principle, you could target to say the equivalent technology of the 1600s or the 1500s or the 1400s to be safe, to give yourself some margin for error. And we know, for example, anybody who studied history, you look at European culture and the Renaissance in the 1500s, it was spectacular. I mean, what they did was amazing in terms of art and culture and architecture and paintings and, I mean, you know, theater. I mean, everything that really matters was spectacular, really, then, in many ways, almost in every way superior to what we're doing today, by the way, because technology drives those things today and it drives them down. So all those things actually, it's not like it's a worse form, it's actually a better form of culture, a higher form, a human form of culture, which is sustainable and non-technological. We could achieve that again. If we unwind ourselves slowly enough that doesn't cause massive death, and just do it slowly and rationally, sort of collectively, probably would require some kind of international agreement that this is the best thing to do for everyone, and just wind it backwards and get back to a safe state. And then you can reassess your situation there. You can say, you know, how are we doing? Is this working? What have we learned? What do we need more of? What do we need less of? And so forth. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think we're basically headed towards catastrophe. I mean, if we continue to advance technology at the rate we're advancing, and if we continue to, you know, I mean, it used to be something that would be seen as like a doomsday scenario if we became so reliant on technology that if you turned the machines off for a day, the entire civilization would collapse. And we're already at that point and well beyond. I mean, so I completely agree. I mean, one criticism that I've gotten is, you know, the myth of the noble savage, that you're basically making it seem like in the past man was good and things were great, and you know that's illogical. But really, my reading of Ted Kaczynski, he's pretty open about the fact that, like, no, man was brutish and brutal, but we still have to go back because the risks are so great if we continue to go forward. I mean, how do you counteract that argument of like the myth of the noble savage?
Yeah, well, that's an independent factor, right? So, yeah, of course, people are brutal and cruel and evil in some sense, and yeah. And do you want those people to have advanced technologies, or do you want them to have to deal with, you know, swords and bows and arrows? I guess I guess if I have, mad lunatics who are running advanced militaries, I'd rather have them deal with swords and spears rather than nuclear weapons and fighter jets and so forth. So, I mean, that's an independent factor across all of history. So that cancels out, right? The thing is, the evil people have more potential to do damage and harm today than they did in the past. It's not like you're better in the past. They were probably the same. We have to assume that they were the same. Actually, probably they were better. That's actually a separate argument, but we can sort of even just say, let's say everybody, say we had a certain percentage of people who are lunatics and, homicidal killers and maniacs and megalomaniacs and so forth. Yeah, okay. So we want those people to have less power, not more power, and that happens in a less technological society. But it also is better suited to human nature, right? I mean, so the way we evolved over time, over almost 3 million years now that the genus Homo has been in existence, was in this hunter-gatherer state. So it was very simple technology, small societies, very small societies of 100 to 150 people, living very simple lives, in direct contact with a nature that was basically, vibrant and more or less untouched. I mean, obviously we caused some damage over time, but relatively untouched. And that's kind of how we learn to live and evolve to live. That's how our bodies and our physiology and our minds, our psyches, evolve to live under those conditions. So, and you don't change your genetic structure over 100 or 150 years. I mean, that takes like typically thousands of years till you're going to adapt to new conditions. So there's no reason to believe that people would not be healthier and happier under simpler technological conditions. The closer you can get to those original conditions under which we evolved for 99% of those 3 million years of our evolutionary history, the closer you can get to that, the better for our health, that we will feel better, we will act better, we'll act more normal, we'll be less stressed. All those things will be better as you move in that direction. And you can be a little bit closer to that, you can be a lot closer to that. That's sort of the argument, right? Yeah, so there's lots of things that we look at and we could say, well, we don't like about those cultures. I mean, in some sense, they were a little bit more brutal. I mean, if you're fighting somebody because you've got some attacker, right? It's like hand-to-hand kind of combat, and it's a lot easier just to push a button and go boom and just fire a drone and just kill somebody. That's like fun. That's like a video game, right? And it's a whole other ball game. Like I got a knife and you got a knife, and somebody's going to survive and somebody's not. I mean, so yeah, it sounds pretty brutal, and in a sense it is, but in a sense it's not. You know what I'm saying? Because that's sort of the condition of nature, and you learn to live and adapt to those conditions, and that's how all of us came to be here, because of countless generations of people who lived like that and dealt with those problems, and some of them fought and some of them died, like today. Okay, that's how it goes. Yeah. So it's not really a question of better or more noble. It tends to be that, I'm thinking even back to like Rousseau. So it's interesting, if somebody brings the noble savage argument up, you could talk about Rousseau, right? And he talks about how even in the society of the mid-1700s in Europe was corrupting the human nature because it took us away from our natural conditions. And it's the same kind of argument. Nietzsche made the same kind of argument as well. So yeah, I mean, that's not really the point. The point is, there's always sort of been good people, always been bad people, but the bad people have less power, and all of us are in a better state the simpler that the technology is that we live with. So that's the clear counter argument. There's no reply to that one. I mean, that shuts that argument down, I think, completely.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is one of the more common criticisms of these ideas, I would say. I mean, I've been reading recently Ted Kaczynski's paper called Techie's Wet Dream. Have you read that one?
I think I know about it.
It's a paper he wrote, and he basically argues that a lot of the technophiles, he calls them, he talks about technianity as a religion, basically, and he argues that there's going to be this attempt by the techies to sort of merge man with machines, like brain-computer interfaces and things like this. And he says the idea that the techies are going to live forever is a fantasy, because the biological portion of us will not be able to evolve as fast as the mechanized non-biological portion. So over time, what little human element remains will be phased out in short order. How do you sort of see, because we're seeing this more and more now. I mean, we're seeing with Neuralink, we're seeing with like this attempt to basically merge humans with machines. I think it's catastrophic. I think it's going to be horrible. I do think it's going to happen, though. I mean, I think we're seeing it in the early phases right now play out. I hope it doesn't happen, but I think it will. How do you sort of see that playing out? I mean, and is there a way to resist this, or what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, so, I mean, sometimes that goes by the name of transhumanism, right? So we're trying to sort of surpass the human condition, right, with some kind of technological merger or something. So, yeah, once again, Ted, I think that's basically right. That, you can have hybrid forms, if you will, where people have things integrated in them, chips or implants or transmitters or whatever it might be. And that's kind of like a crude, awkward phase that probably is not stable in the long run. So it's not like you're going to live like a person, except you'll be a better person and you'll be healthier and stronger and you'll live forever. I mean, that's kind of this silly little fantasy world, this wet dream that Ted talks about, that everything's going to be great, only better, right, because of these machines. And that's virtually certain to not happen, right? Either it'll be some uncontrolled, unpredictable situation, or the hybrid system will evolve to the point where, yeah, exactly, that the technological component will outstrip the biological component, and then whatever hybrid system or hybrid beings are around there, like, yeah, we don't need that squishy, blood and flesh kind of stuff, and that's just kind of fallible and that's messy and just a lot easier to function purely electronically or abstractly, or in information bits and bytes and so forth. So yeah, there's really no reason to believe that's anything more than a transition state into which you no longer exist. So that's like a pathway to extinction, basically, and it's a typical story of the technophiles who know that people are worried, but they have to come up with some story about why we need to keep going ahead anyway. So they come up with a variety of cute little scenarios. The obvious one is all the health benefits. So every time there's a technological breakthrough, they'll virtually always will tell you, oh, the new health treatment that this will do, it'll stop cancer, it'll also reverse aging, or whatever stupid things. So they'll think of some crazy thing. Every new technology, it's actually good to watch for. Every new advance, every new story, there's always a health angle. Oh, look, this is going to help us solve this health problem. Like, yeah, right. But that's the little story to justify the funding and the increased effort to do it, because otherwise it's expensive and it's wasteful and it's dangerous, because it's promoting the overall technological advance. So yeah, these are excuses, right? One is the health benefits. One is the sort of the superpower thing that you're going to gain from some hybrid transhumanist system, or you'll get to sort of upload your mind and you get to live sort of forever in some kind of database. But yeah, that's virtually impossible. So that's just a story that they're telling us to keep us buying into this myth that they need to, which is that we need to keep advancing the technology. And I guess in a sense, it's almost more pernicious than that. It's almost like technology itself is creating these stories to keep itself moving ahead and evolving. And it's like, it sort of like knows that it needs us, at least for now, maybe not for much longer. But it has to convince us that this is a good thing and we need to keep trying to do it, investing money and time and effort and so forth. So in a sense, it's the system protecting itself, creating these stories, so that some portion of humanity, and certainly the most influential, will keep buying into it, and to keep it going.
Yeah, I mean, we're, the way I say it is like we're watching ourselves being phased out. I mean, we are watching the extinction of the human race essentially through technology. It's playing out before your eyes. You don't want to believe it, but you see it everywhere. And the more you see it, once you see a little strand, the whole thing unravels before you see all these little incidences that sort of make it obvious that this is happening. And it's really catastrophic and frightening, to be honest. But another thing he talks about in the manifesto is sort of the psychology of leftists. And this is actually a very large portion of the manifesto. Like when I first was reading it, I was sort of shocked how much of the manifesto is focused on that. What do you think it is about leftist psychology that he is worried about in terms of being sort of antagonistic or routing out the revolution?
Yeah, right. So it's a preemptive move, I think, on his part. And you're right. I was also surprised that there was so much on leftism and leftist processes and psychological aspects. Like something like a third of the manifesto, and the first third is all about these kind of issues. I mean, you're reading and reading and reading, like, wait a minute, he's not even really talking about technology. Where's the technology stuff? It takes a long time to get to it. And I think in one sense he did that on purpose. He wanted to weed those people out who got offended by us talking about leftists, and they're like, oh, I don't want to die, and then they just don't bother with it. He wants to get rid of those people because, right, and he has good reason to say this, right, because sort of leftist, almost by definition, has an overwhelming sense of, let's say, anthropocentric thinking. So human-oriented thinking, which, okay, you can say that's fine. It's nice to be concerned about human welfare and so forth, but not at the expense of these larger issues. So in a sense, it's like short-term benefit leading to long-term harm, right? It's like the mother with a bratty little kid who every time he screams, she gives him some candy, and the kid screams and she gives him some candy. That's okay. She wants him to stop screaming and be happy, but in the long term, it's doing harm, right? It's causing harm. And I think Ted's seeing that same thing in leftists. They tend to sort of recognize that there's a threat to humanity, but the actions that would be required, namely a revolutionary action against the system, would cause potentially, yeah, like we said, lots of suffering and death, right? I mean, if you do a sudden collapse and millions or billions of people will die from this, then the leftists say, oh no, this is horrible, we can't have anybody die, we don't want anybody to die, everybody's got to survive and everybody has to live. And this is sort of extreme over socialization, as he would say, overvaluation on humans, and no human suffering at any cost, which leads in the end to catastrophic human suffering. So it's just a stupid, counterintuitive position to take. But those people are there, and because they're short-term thinkers and they're sort of misguided, they don't really understand that you need to take hard action sometimes for the long-term benefit. And those people will be attracted to revolutionary movements, which they typically are, and they will sort of undermine them and in a sense destroy them. So Ted was concerned that if there's sort of this beginning of revolutionary thinking against technology, that it may attract leftists who will quickly figure out that, oh, this is actually too dangerous and it's causing potentially too much harm. So we have to change it from not so revolutionary to kind of soft revolutionary to maybe more a reform thing, and then maybe just go away altogether. I mean, he talks about how this will just really corrupt a true revolutionary movement. So he's really trying to get people, warn them about the dangers, and in particular revolutionary groups, to get them to not allow this kind of leftist infiltration, which could undermine the purpose of your action, your revolutionary action.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting point to note as well that people tend to sort of pathologize the experiments that he underwent at Harvard or whatever. And to me, it's like this is really irrelevant to what he's talking about. People tend to try to detract from his work by focusing on the personality of who he was. As well, the reason he doesn't like leftists is because he had bad experiences at Harvard. It's irrelevant whether he had bad experiences. What's the primary point he's making is that we're sort of headed off a cliff. Technology is going to lead to the enslavement or maybe the extinction of the human race. And, how do we fight against that? Ken, what do you think will be the catalyst? I mean, when you look out to the future, what do you think will be the catalyst to where people will wake up to the dangers of technology itself? We're kind of seeing it with social media a little bit. People are starting to think like, what age should we allow people to have phones or kids to have phones? What do you think will be the catalyst to where people say technology itself is a danger to humanity? Or do you think there will be a catalyst?
Well, right. So right. That's a good question. what I have said is it will take a sort of a major catastrophe that's clearly a technological catastrophe. So it's going to be like a major shock, right? Like a major wake-up call, like a slap in the face. And it's going to take, I don't know, hundreds of millions of people like being killed by something. Maybe an AI generated virus under some weird conditions that got, automatically released. You can imagine there's different sort of crazy scenarios. It's going to be tough because there always will still be a human element. And so whatever, if some disaster happens, they'll say, oh, look at those bad guys. They were evil. They were stupid. They made mistakes. So it's always a good question about what it will actually take to people to say, look, it's actually the technology which is causing this to happen. So I think what we're in the position now, we're transitioning from systems that are hybrid, human and technological, to being increasingly autonomously technological and less human, if you will. So systems are, and this is part of the AI generated stuff, right? AI powered systems are operating more autonomously, more independently. They're controlling more aspects of manufacturing and research and production and so forth. So as that progresses along, the sort of the fraction that's AI tech related will be growing, and the fraction that's human related will be shrinking. And, I think then when the inevitable catastrophe happens and millions or billions of people die, then you'll have to say, well, look, it was, 90% from the machines and only 10% from a few operators who were involved in doing some things. And maybe if there's enough of us sort of out there willing to raise our voices, we can say, look, it was actually the technology. If we got rid of the technology, that would have never happened. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. So, but it's going to take a kind of a near catastrophic event, I think, to really shock humanity into action. That's the bad part, right? COVID was sort of like a test disaster, like I said, which caused a few million deaths, which was really insignificant in terms of the whole planet, caused a lot of inconvenience for people, and it economically was problematic and disrupted education and all these kind of things, but was not the kind of the real slap in the face disaster that we would need. But that was like a warning shot. I think it's going to be like that, only much worse in the relatively near future. So yeah, I think as systems become increasingly autonomous, it will become clearer, and the case will be stronger than ever. It's already stronger than ever, that these are technologically driven disasters. And that the only solution is a retrenchment of the technological system itself. It's just not that we just don't need smarter people or better trained people or more moral people or whatever they want to say. That's not going to happen. That's not even possible. That will not solve the problem. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I think that you've written a little bit about, and I know Ted spoke about it in some papers I think I read a long time ago, is art. Like sort of how, we're sort of seeing this AI generated art now. And, if you read a lot of these artist forums, they're kind of like scared and intimidated because they take a copy of someone's art and they kind of modify it a little bit and it's something new. It's really theft in my view, but I mean, it's new. And this is sort of like a direct attack on the human being because this is sort of the one thing people thought. Well, the machines, they're not going to be able to replicate that because that's a part of the human soul or the spirit or whatever. And we're seeing that's one of the first things to go. And it's sort of like everyone is at risk. Whatever thing you can think that you can do, the machines are eventually going to be able to do it better. And how do you think art will play into, the view of humans with technology? Do you think people will view that as a good thing, that the AI can do all our art now, or do you think that's going to be sort of such an attack that will wake some people up maybe to the idea that maybe we don't want to live in a world where the machines are creating all of the art? That used to be what we did, Do you think that could play a role?
Yeah, possibly. I tend to think that's maybe a little bit too benign. It's not much of a disastrous thing, I guess, unless you're an artist. Maybe it's pretty disastrous then, but that's a relatively small segment of the society. But yeah, right. The machines will increasingly do what people did. People looked at other people, they copied that, but they changed it. They added something new, some new elements, some new aspect of things, and that's how all culture, whether it's painting or sculpture or music, it all evolves, right? Yeah, everybody sort of takes cues and bits and pieces from existing works and existing artists, and you build on it. You make it a little bit more, a little bit better, and yeah, so AI can increasingly do the same thing. Um, it depends on what the outcome of that is. If it's strictly an artistic or an aesthetic thing, it may not have much effect. It may just be a curiosity in some sense. Maybe some people say, wow, this is cool. Look at, what these purely AI generated, whatever, music or movies, or video games. You can imagine AI building video games that are all really, crazy and bizarre and fascinating in some sense. And yeah, so I don't know. It may be, again, one of these little kind of a story that you can use by the pro tech people to kind of say, look at all this great stuff we've got, but yeah, in a sense, it is frightening, right? Because it does take away sort of one of those last aspects of humanity, right? Where our cultural nature or our spiritual nature, our aesthetic nature, which we said for a long time, well, machines can't do that. Computers will never be able to do those kind of things, write great poems or create a symphony or these kind of things, right? Or great paintings. But yeah, I think probably we're heading that way. And, that's just a further step in the dehumanization process, is how technology does. It increasingly dehumanizes us by doing all the things that we do, except it does them better. So, it does calculation and data storage and, photographic and replication and manufacturing, movement, motion, transportation. We used to be able to do all those things, and now all of those things are increasingly done better, faster, more efficient by the machines. So it's, in a sense, it's all displacing us, right? Yeah, in a sense, it's sort of like surpassing us. That's really what it is. It's an evolutionary process, right? And I wrote about this in my book, The Metaphysics of Technology. I don't know if you had a chance to read that, but that's really kind of my key book that I put together that really sort of explains the whole sort of philosophical or metaphysical process by which technology is really an autonomous, self-evolving system, which is really part of the evolution of nature. Really, that's what nature does. It's really a very natural thing. It's not really a human-made thing at all. So it can be expected to surpass us in all ways. But the problem is, if it surpasses us, that spells bad news for us and everybody else that's sort of, down the chain and the evolutionary ladder, so to speak, is that we all are potentially at risk from this new higher power, which can do everything better, faster, and more powerfully than we can do it. So yeah, again, so art may wake some people up and may add one more thing to the pile, and maybe the one last thing we said, well, look, we thought they couldn't do that, but look, now they're doing that better than us. It may help in some cases, but probably the disaster scenarios will be much more educational and instructive, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely gonna take a disaster in order to truly wake people up. But I think all of these things are sort of mounting on each other. We're seeing, more and more of this sort of dehumanization. I think is a great word for it, because there really is we're being sort of removed from the process. Human beings, like you don't have personal interactions as much anymore. You're seeing, people thought social media would bring us together. It turns out it's distorting our relationships more than ever. Also, one thing I wanted to ask you was, what do you think about democracy in the age of advanced technology? I mean, I've read a lot of theorists who say that, democracy in the age of advanced technology is impossible because you have deep fakes. If you've seen any deep fakes, where basically, I've watched some of them, it's hard to tell. And, I can imagine in 5 years from now where it would literally be impossible to tell. And if you have an open, democratic system where people can publish whatever they want, it's going to be virtually impossible to distinguish between the illegitimate versus the legitimate, the true versus the false. I mean, how do you see that playing out, like the actual political system going forward?
Yeah. People don't understand that technology basically destroys everything. It destroys the economy, it destroys nature, it destroys the human beings, it destroys the human psyche, it destroys culture, it destroys art, it destroys democracy. So basically, even now, we basically have a non-viable, non-functional democracy such that it barely is even worthy of the name. I've written about it, calling it basically something like an industrial democracy. It's like a separate thing, right? Which really has very little in common with the original democracy, which comes from ancient Greece, right? So it's interesting to read the stories and the creation of democracy in ancient Athens and read the works of Plato and Aristotle and how they viewed even then that democracy was flawed and that they had better systems and there were reasons why it could not work. And technology makes all those reasons, all the bad reasons, worse. So yeah, I mean, democracy is really non-viable in any large-scale society. I mean, we've got, 330 million people in the U.S. now, completely non-viable. It's really, even prior to advanced tech, it was basically meaningless because you're working at the level of the mass, right? So the candidates, such as they are working at a level of the mass mind, the mass intelligence, which is like so low that you go to the lowest common denominator, and when you go 300 million people, the level is so low. You're talking to the level of a fourth grader, which is literally what they do. You look at the language of these candidates, and they're working at the level of third or fourth graders. So it's not even viable then. And then you add in the component where you can't trust any of the information. You can't trust the data. You got false information. You got fake news. You got infiltrations. You got distortions. I mean, it completely, whatever little shred of democracy might have been there, that got destroyed. So that's gone and ruined. So really, you've got really nothing left. And the problem is it's advanced technological system of which the scale is far too vast for human beings, ordinary human beings, to function in, right? And again, remember, our original societies that we all evolved to live with was 100 or 150 people. It was a small band of people in a hunter-gatherer system. And democracy works real good there, right? You know everybody, you talk to everybody, you say, hey, what do we want to do? And I think we should do this and we should do that. And you sort of take a vote and you say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. I mean, that's really how it ever got started. It was sort of that way for probably a couple of million years. It got formalized in Athens. And they achieved fantastic things with a really sort of a very simple, direct kind of system of democracy. But that was low-tech, direct, small-scale democracy, and that's the only way democracy works. And people have sort of recognized that for a couple of thousand years now. If you actually want democracy, you have to do a couple of things. You have to radically decentralize your society. So you break it down into small, manageable units of not more than maybe 1 million people. Even that's arguably not really functional, but you've got to be small, independent political units that are non-technologically driven, so that you don't have all the problems of distortion and fake information and fake news and fake videos and all these kind of things that are generated by people. So, I mean, in principle, it's possible to have it, but we haven't had it for a long time, and whatever little bit we had is being being destroyed as we speak. So it's a joke. We shouldn't even really talk about it. We should call it technocracy or something. We need a new name, because that's really what it is. It's really nothing at all like a democracy as originally conceived.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think technology has shredded the idea of democracy. I mean, it's a joke at this point. I mean, the algorithms are running things. People are, there's no sense that anyone's actually contributing to any sort of decision making going on. And that's part of the other thing is you're so far away from power now because of technology as well. Like, you don't have any real influence anymore. And one thing that was really shocking to me too is Andrew Yang. I don't know if you remember him. He was running sort of on this UBI, universal basic income theory. We're going to have a UBI. And it was amazing to me listening to that. So we're basically just going to beg the machines for a distributed share. We've become so, out of the loop of the production at this point where the machines are just going to give us a distributed share. We're basically zoo animals. I mean, we've reduced ourselves to the status of zoo animals, and and everyone's like, yeah, it's a great idea because they just want more money. They want to be able to consume more stuff, not seeing the bigger picture that, like, we've been reduced to fully replicatable appliances. I mean, but do you think they'll be able to create a conscious machine? If we truly live in a materialistic universe and we do create a conscious machine. AI, Ray Kurzweil, Singularity 2045, people are theorizing this could actually happen. I've read some critiques, some counter arguments, but do you think it will happen, that we will create a conscious machine? And if that does happen, I view that as the end. I think that's the end of the human being. But do you think it could happen?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, so if you're familiar with my other work in philosophy of mind, I've written about panpsychism, right, which basically says that consciousness is more or less ubiquitous in nature. So it's not a human thing, it's not an animal thing, it's not a life thing. It's sort of a universal quality of the universe. And really, in some sense, I would say the machines are sort of already conscious. I don't really like that term because it's sort of very anthropocentric and it has a lot of connotations. So, maybe it's better to think about them as experiential things or in-minded beings or something, right? But I think there's actually a strong argument that they already are that way. And I mean, it's a classic problem of how do you know, right? How can you prove that these things are or are not conscious, as you will? It's an old problem in philosophy. I mean, even between people, right? I mean, if I can doubt that you're even conscious. Maybe you're just a sort of a biological robot, and you actually don't feel anything on the inside, and you say, oh no, yes I do, and well, okay, you're just saying that. I mean, you actually can't prove it to me that you are a conscious being. I mean, it's really kind of a funny philosophical problem. So, yeah, really hard to do with animals, hard to do with plants, certainly hard to do with machines. But yeah, what we will see is just increasing cleverness, increasing complicated behavior, and increasing autonomy of the way these things act. And it's not going to be some sort of evil genius kind of laughing at us in the background. It's not like science fiction movies. That's probably not the way it's going to work. It's probably just going to be a giant, vast networked system of some kind that can function more or less autonomously and can do things autonomously in the real world. And yeah, I think probably behind that there is a kind of an experiential entity, a unified mind behind that. Which grows in complexity with the complexity of the system, basically. But I mean, I'm not like, it's not like some people kind of saying, well, they're not there yet, and suddenly, bing, the light's going to come on, and then then they're going to start, walking like super robots and wiping people. I mean, it's not going to work that way, right? I think basically they're already kind of some level of consciousness or awareness. They're going to grow in that, and it will quickly. This is the point of Kurzweil and singularity. They're going to quickly outstrip our ability to even understand them. So they'll be so complicated, so sophisticated, so multidimensional in their action that we won't really even understand what's going on. Things will just happen, and they won't be good things, and we won't really understand why or how they're happening. So that's probably the sign that we really need to look for, that autonomously driven bad things start happening. And you hope that could be sort of a trigger event, boom, where suddenly it's catastrophic autonomous event, which we're sort of hoping, fingers crossed, that doesn't happen. Maybe it's small little warning shots of little disasters, like then you're thinking like, wow, that was really frightening how this particular system was so complex that we didn't know what was going on, and look at these horrible things that happen. And maybe that's one of those wake-up moments for people. Then they'll sort of realize that, hey, these things are thinking far beyond human capabilities, and if we don't stop them like immediately, then it may be unstoppable, and then yeah, all bets are off, and it's probably some nightmare scenario at that point.
Yeah, I definitely think AI, conscious machines, whatever you want to call them. I think that's one of the endpoints for humanity. I think genetic engineering is another one that's really dangerous. The fact where people are already contemplating. You saw that experiment out of China, I'm sure, where they one of the geneticists took the genetic code out of these twin girls, I think, and it worked, quote unquote, but he got thrown in jail. Like, you're already seeing this stuff, and it's like we're experimenting with really dangerous territory. I guess the last question I had for you was, how do you see the revolution? I mean, there's younger people like me who are waking up, who have sort of adopted an anti-tech embodiment of ideals, so to speak. I think technology is very dangerous. And how do you see the revolution? I mean, you're someone who you've written to Ted Kaczynski directly. how do you see the revolution going forward in the future? Where are we at now? Or are we obviously we're in more danger than we've ever been in? If our theory is correct, that technology is going to lead to catastrophic outcomes. How do you see the revolution as it stays today?
So there's always a pragmatic question, right? And I used to talk to my students about this all the time when I was teaching this stuff at Michigan. Okay, even if I buy all this disaster scenarios, what do I do, right? I got to live my life. What do? I got a job, I got to take care of myself. Maybe I got a family. Maybe I got kids, right? So, there's different levels of what people can do. I guess the obvious thing is to protect yourself, right? You at least have some control over yourself. So you have to manage your own lifestyle to disengage as much as you possibly can, right? This is sort of always the challenge. If you disengage completely, then you're completely removed from society, and that has certain consequences. That's, in a sense, that's what Ted did, right? Ted said, "Oh, screw this mess. I'm moving out to Montana. I'm living in a cabin, and I'm gonna, do a little hunting and raise my own food." And yeah, okay. You could sort of do that. That's a really tough way to go. Even in the primitive days, it wasn't just one guy who goes off into the woods and he's living out there. It was always a group of people, because it's really hard to survive alone out in the woods. But the point is, if you isolate yourself, then you no longer have you sever the connection with society. And even in my case, so I sort of have the same dilemma, right? I recognize all these things are dangers, but I still talk to people. I still do Zoom calls. I still answer emails. Okay, I try to keep it to a minimum as much as I can. I'm not sort of on my phone 24/7. In fact, I barely use my phone if I can help it. People text me on my cell phone. I don't read it for like a week. It's like crazy. But so I have like zero social media presence. There's like a website that I sort of a bare bones website just to kind of keep a presence. But to me, it's sort of like, as an educator, if I take my role as an educator seriously, I have to be engaged with people, or I can't even educate them. In a sense, it's proof of the system, right? The system forces me to engage in technological means to even talk to people in some sense. And so that's a compromise that I have to make. I try to minimize the effect on me personally, and on my family, right? So I have two grown daughters now, but when they were young and growing up through the school system, public school system here in Michigan, and you've got to take special actions to protect children who are vulnerable. So we were extreme in our actions to protect our two girls, to keep them out of programming classes and typing classes and keyboarding classes and no word processing and no phone. Everything was pushed to the very last possible moment, and we got a lot of flack from the school system, but they had no argument in their own defense. And I had a lot of arguments in my defense, but they didn't want to hear that, because that was sort of counter to the social trend those days. So I guess, but the point is, right, so there's things you can do to protect yourself, your family, your children, right, to recognize what's going on, to minimize any potential harm to yourself, which comes from too much screen time, too much, I don't know, for younger guys, too much video game time. I don't know what you guys are spending time with, social media time. You really need almost nothing, right? I obviously, easy for me to say, because I can survive pretty well and I don't have any social media. I don't play video games. I don't do a lot of that stuff. I barely watch television. I'm not on my phone, about once a week. But yeah, I guess the thing is to watch what you do in your life and your family's life, whatever you can affect, and try to minimize that, right? Talk to people about these issues. Try to convince people of the severity of the danger, and talk to them about the radicalness of the solutions, right? It's kind of an education, information process for a lot of people. That sounds kind of maybe relatively passive. You can say, well, that's not really very radical. It's not very revolutionary, but in a sense it is. Even just taking these views and stating them publicly is actually pretty revolutionary in a sense. And arguably there's not much more we can do. It's not like, like I used to say in the old days, when you want to revolt against the king who was a tyrant, you'd get a couple of guys together and you get your your pitchforks and your torches, and you go up to the castle and you break in and you kill the king or chop his head off or something, right? So it was pretty clear what to do then. You want to be revolutionary. It was pretty clear, and you can't do that now. There's no equivalent to that. So you have to be outspoken, talk about things, protect yourselves, maybe argue for visions of society that are de-technified, de-technological, and that are in a positive sense, that can retain what people need, what we want for culture, can protect nature, respect the environmental component of things, because environment pays a huge price for technological society. It's just a matter of putting these things out there in a very blunt form. I mean, I think those can have a kind of triggering effect. And maybe for a lot of us, that's maybe the most revolutionary thing we can do. I mean, some people are always kind of pushed towards direct action, where you're sort of actively involved, like the old environmentalist guys, like the Earth First guys did, and they just take direct action against machinery to stop environmental damage. Not much to say about that. It's like who you are, and if people are going to take those kind of actions, then that's up to them. It's nothing I can't tell you about that, or I can't organize that. I mean, it's sort of up to people to decide what's necessary at a level of say individual people or small groups who can act that way. But for most of us, including myself, it's more of an education, self-protection, an awareness, teaching, kind of in a collective, how can we move to a better state, and how can we collectively avoid, mass catastrophe, is really sort of, that's pretty revolutionary in itself, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just holding these ideas that, people are, it has become sort of like almost, I don't want to say a religious phenomena, but like the next iPhone, the next advance, like people are addicted to this. It's become it's a feedback loop, a very powerful feedback loop that people are caught in. And, just saying like, hey, maybe we shouldn't, maybe technology is the problem. That's a very radical statement in and of itself. I agree with you. Well, it was good talking to you. And, I'm from Michigan too, which is kind of, I don't want to say I'm proud that Ted Kaczynski came to Michigan, but like in a way, it's interesting that such a historic figure who is anti-tech, moved to Michigan for a while. But it was good talking to you. And
right. That's my university, University of Michigan, the same one that Ted got his PhD in mathematics. So yeah, it's kind of a nice little irony there, but maybe prompted me to take the lead and be active in this whole issue. But
or maybe the technology knew that we would be interested in anti-tech theory, and they linked us to this. That way, we wouldn't be able to. No, I'm just kidding. But it was good talking to you, and hopefully we'll be able to do another interview in the future.
Yeah, very good.